For years, the men and women who help feed America have had trouble feeding themselves. We're talking about the many farmers who, even before the pandemic, were struggling to stay afloat. According to a new Wall Street Journal report, the Trump administration is set to distribute a record $33 billion in payments to farmers. But despite the federal aid, more and more farmers find themselves filing for bankruptcy. For more on this, the author of that report, Jesse Newman, joins me. She's an agricultural reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Jesse, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Jesse, many farmers, as you point out, were financially on the brink long before the pandemic. Tell us a little bit about the things they've been struggling with for some time now.
That's right. Farmers have really been struggling for a number of years, even before the coronavirus pandemic hit. Their most recent problems really began in about 2014 when commodity prices began to drop. And that was as a result of a grain glut across the globe, and we saw lower prices for commodities like corn and soybeans and wheat. And then in the past 2 years, we've also had the trade wars that have really caused just increasing problems for farmers. We saw major agricultural buyers, countries like China and Mexico, they levied retaliatory tariffs on U.S. products like soybeans and pork, and that had a dampening effect on U.S. exports, which then translated directly into lower prices and lower incomes for farmers.
And then adding insult to injury, the pandemic lands, which has also changed consumer behavior and disrupted the country's food supply chain, from meat plants becoming hotspots to empty grocery store shelves to restaurants shutting down and causing all this waste in farm products. So how has all of this combined to impact farmers today?
That's right. The pandemic has really upended the food supply chain across the board. So it began when the virus, began spreading across the country, and we saw lockdown orders take effect. And that closed restaurants and schools and theme parks. And what that did is it immediately slashed demand for a lot of the products that farmers grow and raise. So we saw farmers in Florida and California, produce farmers, plowing under thousands of acres of vegetables. We saw dairy farmers who were dumping millions of gallons of milk into manure lagoons. And this is because so much of these products typically goes into the food service chain and is served to people at restaurants or schools and some of these other institutions. And all of a sudden, that demand had just evaporated. And you mentioned meat packing plants. When we saw a lot of the meat processing plants and slaughterhouses in this country turn into hotspots for the virus, that prompted some of them to slow production or to halt production entirely. And that had a huge ripple effect back to livestock farms, where farmers were having to keep animals in their barns for longer and feed them for longer. And so costs were mounting for these farmers who no longer had any place to take their products to market.
And now we're seeing an increase in the number of farmers who are applying for Chapter 12 bankruptcy. Is it as bad as it sounds? So can you explain to us how Chapter 12 bankruptcy works, how it's intended to protect farmers financially, and is that intended protection enough to save them?
Sure. Chapter 12 bankruptcy, it's a special form of bankruptcy that farmers, family farmers and family fishermen exclusively are eligible for. It was created during the 1980s farm crisis when there were a lot of farmers going out of business. And it is designed to help them stay in business if possible. So farmers under Chapter 12 bankruptcy protection can take 3 to 5 years to repay their debts. They can reorganize their businesses, sell off some land or some other assets to try to stay in business. So when you hear that a farmer is in bankruptcy, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is one less farmer we have in the countryside. It does mean that there is someone who, cannot handle their current debt load and is having to reorganize and work out a plan with creditors to try to pay them back. Some farms will ultimately end up going out of business, but many of them are trying to stay afloat.
We are certainly rooting for those farmers. All right. Well, Jesse Newman of the Wall Street Journal, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.